Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation, our final show to close out what has been nothing short of an exceptional year for us, filled with incredible guests and amazing conversations. We are so incredibly grateful to you, our listeners, for continuing to enjoy our show and helped us to continue to grow this past year. We are proud and humbled to be able to put this show out there, and we couldn't do it without you. We also want to thank all our amazing guests this past year who provide the expert commentary and insights. It is truly their brilliance that makes this show what it is. So, with that in mind, we bring you our 2021 year in review, a fun and snappy way to look back at some of our favorite moments from all the laughs and learnings from this past year. From all of us here at The Negotiation and WPIC Marketing and Technologies, we hope all of you had a Merry Christmas and wish you all a Happy New Year. Enjoy. Our first episode of 2021, and episode 75 overall, featured Matt Sheehan, fellow and researcher at Macropolo, the digital think tank of the Paulson Institute. Matt was an awesome guest to have, as his portfolio features writings on technology in China and its interactions with the US and the rest of the world. During that episode, we asked Matt, what is the Chinese tech ecosystem going to look like in 2025? And here's what he had to say.
I sort of narrowed it down to, one or two key trends that I think are going to really shape things. And those kind of relate back to what I was talking about earlier when you asked about key trends in the Chinese sector, technology sector. I sort of identified in terms of the industry sector-wide trend is this move from sort of consumer-facing platforms to companies that apply emerging technology to traditional industries. And then in terms of, is this going to work out? Is this going to be successful for China? I looked at, as the main obstacle there, restrictions on semiconductor exports to China. Are U.S. restrictions on chips going to fundamentally handicap China's attempt to transition into this more like industrial technology era? And, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of detail in there that, you can of course find in the report, but I'd say the high level takeaway was that on this 5-year time scale, 2020 to 2025, I don't foresee chip restrictions, chip export controls, semiconductor export controls hobbling China's transition to this kind of industrial tech juggernaut that it wants to become. But as we stretch it out further, as we look like 2025 to 2030 and beyond, I do think that restrictions on China's ability to access leading edge semiconductors are eventually going to kind of serve as a bit of a cap on how far they can go with this kind of foundational technology. So for these next few years, even if you don't have access to the absolute most cutting edge chips, you can still do a lot of what you need to do. If you want to build a more like automated factory, or you want to build a 5G network, or you want to build a smart grid, most of these type of applications don't require the absolute most cutting edge chips that the US and other places kind of have a bit of a monopoly on. So I think, in the short term, US export controls to Huawei are probably going to slow down the 5G rollout, which has obviously received a ton of attention, but they're not going to fundamentally hobble the Chinese technology ecosystem. It'll be more about trying to maintain China's long-term dependence on the United States and its allies in Europe, Japan, South Korea, maintain China's dependence on those countries for cutting-edge semiconductors. And as the industry kind of keeps advancing, I think the goal for a lot of US policymakers is don't try to totally obliterate the Chinese tech ecosystem. That's a very dangerous and volatile thing to try to do, but do keep China dependent on these exports, and that then kind of gives long-term leverage to the US and its allies.
Episode 78 brought us a conversation with John Pomfret, a former Washington Post bureau chief in Beijing and the author of both The Beautiful Country and Middle Kingdom, America and China from 1776 to the present. John has also been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. We couldn't have asked for a more esteemed and well-respected guest to talk to us about the future of the world's relationship with China.
First, although Trump was pretty lousy at alliance management, to put it mildly, the Europeans are, Western Europeans in particular, but the Poles as well, Hungary not so much, definitely the Czechs, are concerned about China's influence far more than they used to be. And this is not something that was a result of American pressure. This is something that was kind of organic to their experience. In the past, the Germans used to be the rah-rah team for closer relations with China. And now you have the Germans coming to the United States for more information about how America manages CFIUS, which is the organization in the Treasury Department that looks at foreign investment in the United States as a way to protect German companies. Because for a while, the Chinese were buying one German company a week. This was a few years ago, but nonetheless, the Germans have put a significant damper on China's ability to invest in Germany. So this is not something that's simply an obsession of the United States. You see it in your country as well, in Canada as well. But you're also beginning to see it in the developing world, which used to be the bastion of pro-China feeling. So even in Africa, which has been the beneficiary of a huge amount of Chinese investment, you have significant problems vis-a-vis the Chinese. In Pakistan as well, there have been terrorist attacks against Chinese investment projects there. So you have China being viewed in Pakistan as kind of a new America. So this is not simply, and then of course India, the Chinese have a significantly negative relationship with the Indian public. So, and now in some parts of the world, people love China, but even in those parts of the world, like for example, Brazil, which was having a very positive relation with China under previous administrations, the current administration is very anti-China. And now you have a situation where it's become a political football over what vaccine to use, whether it's the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccines or the Chinese developed vaccine. And that's become a political football. And the Chinese clearly don't want to see that type of problem as well. And then the COVID problem kind of cuts both ways, because on one side, you have a lot of respect for the Chinese for dealing with COVID so well. At the same time, there remains this residual resentment against China for not really failing, at least in the perception of a lot of people, to cope with the COVID problem in the beginning and to not share information about that as well. So I think it's a very complicated picture, but it's hardened over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. Added to that, if I may, the wolf warrior diplomacy of Chinese diplomats going around the world lecturing countries, lecturing Sweden, lecturing Canada, lecturing Germany, lecturing Poland. People are a bit fed up, lecturing South Africa as well. People are a bit fed up with that type of sort of the new bold Chinese diplomat who are clearly doing it in order to get brownie points in Beijing. But what's happening is in the societies in which they're living, Sweden, South Africa, Brazil, Canada, United States, it's negatively affecting China's public opinion and its soft power.
Up next is a snippet from our conversation with Stevenson Young, a guest we continue to bring back and will be doing so again in early 2022 as an expert on China-U.S. relations. Anne is co-founder and research director of J Capital Research. This particular conversation was from February 2021, and we asked Anne for her thoughts on how the West's perception of China had changed and what the contributing factors might have been.
I think it's two major things. One thing is just a reduction in money flows. So there's just less portfolio money that's going into China. And, when money is flowing into China from America, it's always going to bring with it a lot of business lobbying and a lot of positive opinions, positive interactions with China. So I think that was always going to happen as the amount of investment capital came down. The critical issue really is Xi Jinping. So since he took over in 2012 and officially in 2013, and think of all the things that he's really screwed up. He starts this Belt and Road Initiative, which really has no particular purpose except to obscure China's money management, because after all, we have plenty of multilateral institutions to invest in these countries, and China just wanted to dominate one such institution. He's managed to antagonize an awful lot of the countries that have been targeted by the Belt and Road Initiative. The first focus of the BRI was Southeast Asia, and instead of creating new alliances in Southeast Asia, he antagonized Southeast Asia and sort of moved the Belt and Road west. So there's that. There's the domestic initiatives like building the mega cities, which are going to be huge, 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 the Pearl River Delta and connecting it with Hong Kong and making it into a new metropolis and the area around Beijing and Tianjin. Now you just don't hear anything about that because it's been such a failure and such a money sink. But in fact, Hong Kong has gone totally the other direction. So it's becoming, it's another Chinese city as miserable miserable, as dirty, as locked down, as corrupt as a Zhuhai, rather than becoming part of a broader, more open area in the Pearl River Delta.
Another of our favorite foreign policy experts is James McGregor, author, journalist, and chairman of APCO Worldwide Greater China. We asked James the same question we asked Anne about how he thought the West's, particularly the US's, perception of China had changed and why. And here's what he had to say.
China overreached. They went too far in so many directions, whether it was claiming the South China Sea, building those islands, Mr. Xi telling Obama while he was visiting Washington that he would not militarize the islands, and then they get militarized. All of the different things that China has done that are more extreme, and also Trump, going after China so strongly and noisily. Also, I think changed perceptions a lot. I think it was just ready to happen. I think that the U.S. felt betrayed, actually, kind of betrayed and bamboozled about all of the goodwill they had put into helping China, opening our universities, opening our markets, scholarships, helping them build their legal system, getting them into WTO, on and on and on, and none of that goodwill was ever returned. And I think that created a lot of anger in the United States and globally, with all the hacking and technology theft and forced tech transfer. The problem with China was very good at operating when it had an empty hand. They could negotiate from a position of weakness very well, but once they became strong, they've just overdone it. I think really what's happened is a lot of what we're seeing in front of us were things that were caused by China, its overreach. China, really, the real turning point was the global financial crisis, where China looked around and said, well, wait a second, our system works better. It showed that Wall Street was a mess. It showed that our system had huge weaknesses. They got through the Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis just because they did not open up their financial system to the West and to the world's systems. And they started thinking, geez, our system is better. They also came to the conclusion that the U.S. and Europe also were both in inexorable decline, and that it was China's time. And then all the hubris of the multi-thousand-year civilization and came into play, and it's like, they're getting their rightful place as a leader of the world. And then the behavior, the way they did it was they just started treating the outside world the same way they treat their own people. Tremble and obey, coming down very hard on people, trying to control the narrative of what can be said about them outside the country. I think they at first wanted to try to make the world safe for the Communist Party, that it's like, this is who we are, this is how we operate, just leave us alone and let us operate in the world. Then I think they realized that the best defense is a good offense. It's better to be feared than loved. If you can't be loved, you might as well be feared. But when's the last time anybody in Washington, D.C. said, oh, I wonder what the world will think about this? I mean, the U.S. operates in its own realm in kind of the same way. We're a superpower, so we kind of do what we want. We didn't ask the world. We didn't think about what will the world think when we invade Iraq and other things. So I think it's kind of a superpower hubris.
Up next in our roundup of 2021 is a conversation with Chloe Gonzalez, former Asia e-commerce manager at L'Oreal and digital marketing manager at Alibaba, then international business development manager for Tmall Global. We asked Chloe about the impact live streaming has had on e-commerce in China, specifically on the cosmetics vertical, and the fascinating fact that Chinese consumers use live streaming not to save time, but to spend time.
Yeah, I mean, live streaming is huge among all categories. China is definitely the largest live streaming industry in the world. I think before COVID, there were like 500 million live streaming users, but I think this number skyrocketed after the COVID because people were actually stuck at home, and that was a really good way to sell their products online. So yeah, live streaming is just booming, especially during festivals. We see like brands and bloggers doing 24/7 live streaming, because what is really interesting in China is that actually consumers use e-commerce not to save time as we would do in the West, but to spend time. So even though they don't want to buy anything, they would connect on Taobao and Tmall to watch live streaming, to watch videos, to read blogs and articles, etc. So that's also part of, the way they like to be entertained is like, at 9 p.m., 10 p.m., even even sometimes 12 or 1 a.m., 2 a.m., they would connect and see what live stream are going on and discover new products. So that's the kind of thing they do. And now we've seen so many apps that are doing live streaming. I think there are more than 100 live streaming app or platform that can do live streaming. So this is definitely a big trend. And especially for cosmetics, it's really, really trendy. And we've seen a lot of beauty bloggers like Lydia Chi and Via doing this type of live streaming to help the brand boost the products. And actually a lot of brands, they sometimes buzz thanks to those KOLs, because if Lydia Chi or Via accepts to feature one of your products, it's just a really big, showcase and a big boom for your sales. So it's definitely something that is trendy in the market.
In May of 2021, we brought you our conversation with Charles Lavoie, who leads and manages WPIC's Creative Labs. Prior to joining WPIC, Charles served as the marketing director at BioTwin, the director of strategy and business development at PBB Creative, and China advisor to both Cannes Live Sports and Career Up. We carved out the part of the conversation where Charles discusses cross-border creativity and marketing and how to work with brands that have a framework they want to preserve, yet it needs adaptation and innovation in order to be successful in foreign markets like China.
Agencies tend to push a lot the word creativity. To me, it's really kind of bringing past or existing concepts or inspiration together. Being creative is like in the tech world, making an invention. There's a lot of inventions that are made that are not commercializable, like that you can't commercialize. So it's kind of the gap between invention and commercialization becomes innovation. And there's the same challenge in creativity. So obviously we can be creative as much as we can, but the big challenge is to be creative and relevant, to be creative that people care about and that actually helps the brand. And when it comes to cross-border marketing, the other kind of paradox here is that international brands want to find partners in China that are creative and can help their brand. But at the same time, a lot of them have the conversation, well, this is my brand framework and I don't want you to innovate. I want you to stay within that framework. And then in that sense, okay, how can you be creative when there's that much framework? And that's really kind of the big challenge of cross-border creativity. And that's where you're kind of looking at concept of the culture, and the ultimate goal is to try to convince that, okay, let's take what's existing, innovate. And I would say in cross-border brand building, you're not building a new brand. There's already so much elements existing. So that creativity you kind of want to add on. And then the ideal goal is there something that we can create and innovate that's going to inspire back the headquarters and that they're going to do something? And I've had experience in the past, and that's been, that's, I think, really, really challenging, because the perception sometimes of working with agencies in China is just, it's a secondary market. They take our brand, just execute, use our creative assets, and then just adapt it, tweak it, but don't really innovate. Don't really be too creative. And then there's been a really good case study of the innovations and the creativity that we were able to bring to China actually inspired the people in the headquarters. Oh, we should do that in our home market. And I think that's really what we want to deliver.
Next up is an excerpt from our conversation with Benjamin Wall, a brand strategy, business, and sports development expert. He is head of China for the German professional football club Borussia Dortmund. Prior to this, Benjamin led the China strategy for Bayer 04 Leverkusen from 2016 to 2017, establishing a youth football academy in China in the process. We asked Benjamin how China will be able to grow the sport there, and whether China can and will adopt similar strategies used in other areas of the world, or perhaps borrow from the successes or failures trying to grow other sports in China, and what strategies specific to the China market they would then use.
I think the very first approach is that kids and people are able to play it, right? For many, many decades, China was investing into basketball courts. You lived here many, many years. You see everywhere basketball courts at companies, at parks, everywhere. So that sport was promoted for a very long time. And now that's shifting, or additionally, soccer and football is coming in as well, that you see pitches here and there. Space is very rare in those super mega cities, which you have everywhere in China. But you see that when a company is building a new complex, they have the obligation to build 3 small football pitches as well next to it that people can play. So that's the very first step, that the people are able to play, that you introduce football and soccer to the kindergartens, to the middle schools, and to the educational system. Also a challenge, not that easy, because we all know in China, the educational plan, the curriculum is very tight. You don't have class until 4 or 5 o'clock like in Europe. You have basically it until the evening, and then plus homework. And so you have to integrate football sports into the curriculum of the students. But that's governmental goals, so that's happening. And then on top, the foreign clubs are coming in, right? Promoting the joy, the passion which you can have with football. And I always get the question, who are the Chinese fans? Why do they like football? Why do they like Borussia Dortmund? As you said, in the US, you have a college team. You're growing up with them. It's your university or it's your region. Of course, due to the distance, you don't have that here in China. But if you ask German football fans, Borussia Dortmund fans, you ask 10 people and you get 10 answers. And that's the same in China. We have fans who love a certain player. They're saying, I really like Erling Haaland or Marco Reus. You have fans who travel to Europe and they said BVB was the greatest stadium experience. You have fans who telling you a specific game where they were watching Borussia Dortmund and we won the title or scored a certain goal. You got fashion-driven fans who being like, you got so many young, handsome players. So they're following more the players than the club. So there's such a big variety about football. And that variety we're trying to cover with Borussia Dortmund as well. Not only focusing on sports reports and giving coaching lessons, but of course, promoting the values of the club as well, promoting our atmosphere, organizing travels to Germany to experience this, leveraging the players, how they live beside the pitch, what they're doing in their spare time. So it's a broad business field, I would say.
Episode 93 featured Greg Turner, an industry leader in live sports and entertainment events and venue management in China. He is the founder and managing director at High Performance, which manages and promotes events at the Shantou University Sports Park. Greg himself led the development of the STU Sports Park, a $110 million project donated by the Li Ka-shing Foundation to Shantou University. 2 parts of this conversation jumped out at me while recording this episode. The first was Greg talking about the role between sport and government in China, and the second was explaining the difference between a Western sports fan and a Chinese sports fan and why this difference exists.
So I think that we can do that probably easiest by contrasting like the CBA versus the NBA. You know, the NBA, it's obviously a very commercial driven entity. Its owners make its rules and its owners and the commissioner decide how the league is going to develop and grow. Whereas the CBA, by its nature, I mean, it's the China Basketball Association. It's the governing body for basketball in China, and they just happen to have a league on top of that. So it would kind of be like Hockey Canada running the NHL. Right. But even more so, it's the government running Hockey Canada, running the NHL. So I think that, you know, that's an important thing to keep in mind. And that's true across almost any sport, is that it's very clearly written in any kind of government document you see, is that the associations, which are quasi-government, are responsible for running whatever sport you're going to be dealing with. So knowing that that's the situation, that's why it's so important to take some time to understand how the government's trying to develop sports. Right now, since I think about 2017, the government's been going on with a really strong reform effort for sports. I know one of your previous guests, Radley, he mentioned a few numbers like the size that they want to grow the market to, but it's so much more than that. It's so deep in terms of how it's trying to grow. You know, it's aimed to become one of the pillars of the new Chinese economy. You know, sports consumption and everything that includes. So as they're shifting away from manufacturing and they're trying to become more of a balance with service and manufacturing, or even more on the service side, sports is seen as part of that basket of industries that's going to develop the national economy and help it keep growing. You know, and they, through the economic benefit, they see all the other things coming from that. So as people are buying more sports, whatever they're buying from it, they become more, you know, especially with a strong national team or strong domestic leagues or players succeeding overseas or whatever, they're going to be buying more of that players or that teams or that sports goods. And then they become more connected to that sport and they feel more patriotic, even if they don't play it themselves, even if they're not really that interested in it. And I think that this is something else we could really touch into, is what's the difference between a Chinese sports fan and a Western sports fan. So, I mean, a Chinese sports fan,
a Western sports fan, I mean, like passion is probably the word you'd use to describe a Western sports fan. They just live and die for their team or their favorite player or anything else, right? And they play their sport. You know, like you mentioned before we started recording, you want to play hockey 3 times a week. 1 time's not enough. I'm the same way. I want to play hockey 3-4 times a week when I can. But you know, a Chinese sports fan, they like their team. They're probably more connected to the player, their favorite player, and they'll change teams based on that player just because maybe the player is handsome or has got some special skill that they really connect to, or there's some memory that they have of this certain player doing something very special at one time that they just keep holding on to. But even more so than that, sports is really just one piece of an entertainment diet that they have, right? If they have to choose between watching their favorite player, their favorite team play a game, or go watch a movie with friends, it's actually a really difficult decision, right? And then if you add in dinner, like going out for dinner with friends, they're probably going to choose the dinner first and foremost, right? Because food here, everybody loves food, eating so much. So sports doesn't have that drive, that same passion that we have in the West. And so when international organizations come in here and they try and start building their brand or their sport or whatever they're doing, and they don't connect with people the same way they do in the West, they kind of sit here, they're kind of left scratching their head going, why don't people care? Why don't they care about the sport so much? But the thing is, they do care, but they just don't have the same connection to it that we do in the West. And I think that still goes back to what we discussed earlier with, that missing gap of grade 8 till high school, till university or graduating high school, where they just don't have any sports in their lives.
We hit a big milestone this year, celebrating the 100th episode of the Negotiation Podcast. We were extremely blessed to be able to bring on Dominic Barton, Canadian ambassador to the People's Republic of China, to celebrate. Dominic spent close to 20 years working for McKinsey & Company with a focus on China, at first serving as chairman of Asia for the firm before taking the helm of global managing director from 2009 to 2018 amid China's rising prominence on the world stage. Ambassador Barton is also the co-author of The China Vignettes, which was a glimpse into the complexity and richness of daily life in China. I asked Ambassador Barton about the main insights and takeaways he gained while writing that book.
I'd say there were 4 or 5 things that I sort of took away about it. One is just this deep focus on education and children. That was fundamental. The importance, almost like in the Maslowian hierarchy of needs, we in the West would probably have food first, and then you kind of go up the triangle. I think in China, it would be education first and then food. And there were stories like people I spoke with where they sacrificed what they ate to ensure that there was enough money to send their child or one of their children to school. So just this intense focus on education and wanting the children to do as well as they possibly can. I think the work ethic, that's probably people know that, but it gets back to what we talked about at the beginning, my first impression, people at Friday night at 11 o'clock, people were working, building buildings, and the hours people put in. I still see that today. I'm visiting. I like to make sure I go out into the region, so out to factories and so forth. And people are doing 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. People are working very, very hard. That drive, if you will, the strength of the family unit. I really felt that how people cared about their siblings, their parents, the grandparents, and the sacrifices that people would make for each other, but kind of the strength of the family unit. That struck me. It's people they want to have a better life. I guess the last thing I would just say, generosity. What struck me was, in fact, the poorest people that I met with. I would go and visit these families, and the poorest people were actually the most generous. Everyone was generous, but the most generous. I was really shocked by that. I remember one case, I was with my son and we were in just outside of Chongqing, and there was a rural family that had been moved to an apartment, and they were I think it was the 15th floor of this apartment building, and they had ducks on the balcony, like ducks, right, that were there. And these were obviously very important things. And they killed one of the ducks and cooked the duck for this visit, right? And I remember my son was pretty shocked, right? Because they killed the ducks, they cooked, and it was kind of like from the farm to fork type of thing live and done in a different way. And he didn't want to eat. I remember that he'd say, Dad, I said, you're going to eat everything off. We're going to suck on the bones of this thing if we need to. But people, I just say this because it was just the generosity and that of people. And I found that actually throughout, people just being generous. That was something that really struck me.
This past summer, we were fortunate enough to grab time enough for not just one episode, but two with Zach Dykewald, founder and CEO of Young China Group, a think tank and consultancy with a focus on the emerging influence of China's millennial generation on the marketplace, workplace, and international politics. Zach is also the author of Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. The book explores questions of identity impacting China's young generation, specifically the 420 million or so people born after 1990. This excerpt we pulled has Zach explaining how, in order to understand China's youth, it begins with understanding their parents, the pressures they face growing up, and the landscape they must navigate to find their place in this world.
In order to understand the children, you have to understand the parents. My dad was a psychologist. He moved to Berkeley from Jersey. And so when I was young and feeling anxiety, he had the vocabulary to talk with me about it and not necessarily understand it, but he sort of gets why there's a sort of mental health transition in the United States, transitioning towards just deeper awareness and understanding of it, even though you still get that kind of conservative pushback around, why don't these kids just toughen up? So if you have Americans who grew up in the 60s and 70s wondering why their kids don't just toughen up, think about the generation that built China's manufacturing economy and think about the way that they would understand or not the issues around overwork, around these identity anxieties, pressure around marriage, pressures around jobs, the cost of real estate in China. I mean, this is the parents and grandparents of the millennial generation, the Gen Z generation of China were known as the eat bitter generation. 吃苦的一代. Eat bitter means working extraordinarily long hours for long periods of time. And I'm not talking like work hard for a semester and we'll take you to Disneyland, not that kind of delayed gratification like we have in the US, like working hard for 5 years, 10 years, decades, so that the next generation could have a better life. It's the stories that we hear in the 80s and 90s of early factory China, of people begging for extra hours at the end of the week and the end of the month, because it was the first time in post-communist China that they could work harder and longer and earn more. And that opportunity just lighting them up. And so when you ask those parents to be understanding of the pressures of modernity, there's more generational distance that they have to bridge. I often say that in most of the world, we have generation gaps. This whole the music is too damn loud thing. If you look at like a picture of Woodstock versus a picture of Coachella, the experiences ultimately were not that different between the generations, even though it was 40 years apart. But if you think about the generational chasms, what I call generational gulfs between China's boomers and their kids, there is so much more distance that they have to span. And so that's all to say that this young generation is feeling a couple things right now. First, they're feeling this incredible pressure to get ahead. Second, they're subjected to enormous competition through the Chinese education and job market. And third, they are entering a job market that does not have enough white collar jobs to support the increasingly educated population of young people. And so you get companies like Pinduoduo, Alibaba, JD, whatever, who feel like their employees are disposable and treat them that way. 7-day work weeks, 6-day work weeks. You get a 1-day weekend twice a month. It's why you're starting to see more suicides in these large organizations. And it's a shame. It's a shame that that's where it is. And when I talk with sort of global organizations who are looking to hire in China, and you must, because I mean, the idea that Todd, you or I could do a job as well as some of these young, educated people in China that are in a Chinese market facing role is ridiculous. And anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong. And I'm willing to pound the table on that one. But this quality of life question, this attention to mental health, a willingness of global companies, even though there are struggles for young Chinese people looking to work in global organizations, the ability to have a better work-life balance, the dignity that sometimes comes with these more mature organizations who has more respect for the personal space, personal time, and mental well-being of their young people, to me is a real hiring advantage, especially now when you're looking for top-tier talent in China.
As the summer drew to a close, we started to dig into the upcoming Winter Olympics in Beijing. Our first conversation around this was with Mark Dreyer, a China-based media and sports professional. Mark has been based in China since shortly before the 2008 Olympics, where he has worked with several media outlets, both domestic and international. Mark is the marketing and communications director of the American Chamber of Commerce in China and the founder of China Sports Insider and the China correspondent for Sports Business Group. We asked Mark to talk about what the expectations are for this year's Winter Olympics from a hosting standpoint, which sports Chinese viewers and consumers are most excited about, and what the goals are for China's athletes with respect to participation and performance.
It's such a different event, I think, to 2008. Of course, that was the first Olympics, and the Summer Games are so much larger. I think the messaging here in China around these games, because of COVID, they very much changed to being simple and healthy, and that's kind of become the messaging. So basically, playing it down as much as possible, trying to put on a safe games. So that has, I think, dampened the buzz to a certain extent because, you know, when you think of the Olympics, you think huge extravaganza. Well, people aren't talking about that. They're deliberately playing that down. Of course, the buzz will pick up when we get to the end of the year and we start moving into the home stretch. And as we get to the winter season, we can start to see some of these test events, which are, we hope, going to be rescheduled for the later part of this year ahead of the Olympics, which start on February 4th. I'm sure there will be buzz, but it's just not going to be quite the same. It's not going to be anything like the same as 2008 was, and that's okay. There's reasons that are outlined for that. In terms of expectations, again, I think this will be kind of led by those at the top. They'll play down expectations. China knows that it's not a particularly strong winter sports nation. They'll want to have their best ever performance, I think. I'm certain of that. Whether they will or not is still kind of up for debate. The goal that China has set is not so much medals, it's just to have one competitor in every single discipline. If you look at look in the past, you know, China hasn't had athletes in all the disciplines, for example, cross-country skiing and ski jumping and so on. And so if they can get at least one competitor in every single event, I think that would be a huge success. Now, of course, some of these would in no way would many of these athletes be challenging for medals, but you just never know. I think there's been so much uncertainty, not just for Chinese athletes, but for athletes all around the world in terms of training. There are a reduced number of competitions. We don't know how athletes are going to perform in Beijing next February. And I think we saw this with a lot of surprise. Some of the best, Grace Snow Sports is one of the kind of under the Nielsen sports divisions, and they basically predict. They have a virtual medal table, and it's pretty interesting. They generally do a pretty accurate job, but they did say for this year in particular with the Chinese team, because of COVID, because the team were pretty much restricted to training at home for at least a year before Tokyo, they had no idea the kind of form that Chinese athletes were in coming into Tokyo. And so there's a huge amount of uncertainty. I think that is the same for the Winter Olympics. We just don't know who the form athletes are going to be. We don't know how good they're going to be. I would say that they would probably outperform in terms of surprising the Olympics more than anything else, because it's just that 4-year cycle. You don't really know who's going to be a challenger, and this is only been heightened this year because of the reasons I just mentioned. So a lot of unknowns on so many different fronts, logistically as well as on the field of play. But I think the buzz will pick up. We're just not feeling it just yet. But as I said, that's kind of deliberate at the moment here in China.
We were really fortunate to be able to grab a good friend of mine, someone I deeply respect both as a professional and a person, Ray Ma, an angel investor and fund consultant whose work involves identifying superior tech investment opportunities in both the US and China. She is the co-creator of TechBuzz China, a paid community for investors and operators interested in China tech, and also co-hosts the bi-weekly TechBuzz China podcast. Finally, Ray is the executive chairman of the nonprofit Rookie Fund, which aims to be the best student-run fund for discovering and investing in student entrepreneurs in Asia. Ray is also former managing partner Asia for 500 Startups, so all in all, one of the premier thought leaders around technology and investment, especially with regards to China. During the podcast, I asked her to talk about some of her favorite emerging tech trends coming out of China that the rest of the world should be paying attention to, and here's what she had to say.
My favorites to start are probably just cross-border in general. So specifically cross-border e-commerce. That is really big in China right now. So basically the way to think about it is China has been the factory of the world for the past couple of decades. And because all the top brands in the world manufacture there, the factories there have now have the know-how to make the highest quality things. And it was really about them being able to either make branded products themselves or connect with other domestic brand makers, right? And that's what we've seen happen over the past couple of years, where you have, a lot of people who are either foreign educated or just high industry experience or come from the internet industry and therefore have a very digital way, data-driven way of thinking about things, syncing up with these very qualified manufacturing facilities and making really interesting new consumer goods. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect is, again, the previous model from China had been to export primarily wholesale, right? B2B, unbranded into the rest of the world. And now realizing that the value is really in the branded part, of course, there's these same entrepreneurs I was talking about earlier are capturing the opportunity and creating brands. The market for that is conservatively a couple $100 billion, but maybe in the $1 trillion range. And we're just starting to see that emerge. So that's a big trend. I think the other thing that I'm probably really excited about this is not a sector I know much about, and I'm trying to get to know more about it, but just climate tech in general. You see China really leaning heavily into climate tech for, honestly, for political reasons as well as economic reasons. But politically, it's just climate change is very destabilizing in terms of national security. So the government really needs to be on top of this. And then, of course, this is also a technology that no one else in the world so far has, cracked yet, where this is emerging technology. So China wants to not be behind, right? China doesn't want to have the same case as, semiconductors happen in climate tech because they don't want to be beholden to the West in terms of key IP. They want to develop and own IP themselves. So there's a lot of investment and excitement about that. And governments put forth a lot of favorable regulations. Specifically in climate tech, I think right now the most obvious one is electric vehicles. I drive a Tesla right now, but I don't know. Maybe my next car will be a Neo. I don't know. So we'll see. But the global market is very attractive for all of these companies. And so it's also kind of a cross-border play. And then the third thing, I'll just mention three things. The third thing I'd probably be excited about is Sas Enterprise Software. That's a little less developed than the other two I'm talking about. I think it's still really early, but I've spent a lot of this year talking to late stage pre-IPO enterprise software companies. And I think just it's obvious that there's a big market for that. It's just that the willingness to pay is still not there. So we have maybe about, let's call it, give or take 10 companies that are at an IPO-able stage. And IPO-able really means $100 million in revenue. So that's really not very many when you consider the size of the economy and the number of developers and, the market need. It's growing quickly. So maybe in 2-3 years, there will be a lot more companies that are public that are serving that segment of the market.
As we hit the home stretch of 2021 and things started getting colder here in the Northern Hemisphere, we started having more conversations around the Winter Olympics and talking to experts in the snow sports vertical. Freddie Bacon, Director of Sport Development at Access Leisure Management, is the man tasked with growing the Burton Snowboard Academies across China. Freddie is an expert in the snow sports arena with over 14 years of global experience, so I asked him to broadly talk to us about the resorts in China to facilitate those academies and discuss whether their economic models would include more year-round activities, such as mountain biking the way we're seeing more resorts in the West focus on, in an effort to drive revenues as operational costs continue to climb.
Yeah, this is a really important point. Resorts here are trying to be four-season resorts and as such have year-round revenue. I think a key point to make is that it's very difficult with the amount of customers that resorts are seeing here. It's very difficult to get the staff that's required to service that amount of people. And by the time you've trained 500 to 1,000 staff and you've given them all seasonal contracts, they go away for 6 months, and then you have to try and find another 500 to 1,000 staff, give them all another seasonal contract. And this ongoing repetition of training and non-retaining staff because perhaps they've gone off to different jobs or different industries. And so it's very important for resorts who are looking to improve their service quality to be able to hire people year round. And maintain staff. And once they've delivered training, that they're going to get value out of that training for years to come. And so as part of that is to make sure that there is a year-round business model to ensure that there can be an opportunity to employ people. And so I think for now, there are resorts that do it more as a service. And until summer customer understanding and knowledge that these resorts are open year-round grows, I think it's definitely the focus is still on winter. But there are places in China, for example, Chongli, where the Olympic some of the Olympic venues will be happening. By train, it's 48 minutes from Beijing, and in middle of summer, it's mid-20s in terms of temperature, so 25, 26 degrees. It's green, it's beautiful, versus Beijing that's potentially 40 degrees and humid. And so you can just jump on a train for the weekend, be in the mountains in 48 minutes in beautiful weather with huge mountain environment. And now the resorts are putting on activities. So for families, there's so much to do. You can just go out there for a weekend or even a couple of days in the week. And if I was to make a prediction, I would actually think that in many years to come, these resorts will potentially be busier in summer than they are in winter. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the coming years. But I can see lots of people buying property up there, not to necessarily be spending lots of time there skiing and snowboarding in the winter, but to have an escape from Beijing in the summer months.
One of our more recent episodes was with Craig Smith, CEO of Burton Snowboards China. Founded in 2013 in Beijing, Burton China has grown to over 40 dealerships nationwide and 7 premium partner resorts. No stranger to building the Burton brand abroad, Craig actually started with Burton at their Tokyo office 2 decades prior. I asked Craig to talk about what it was like growing a brand like Burton in China when the branding is so much around a lifestyle, much more than it is just a product, and how physical retail and mono-branded stores are such an important component of brand experience and brand validation, and not as much around revenue from direct sales.
The most important focus for Burton China is sharing the fun of the lifestyle around snowboarding. To be very honest, we wouldn't have to do too terribly much marketing. We have to do too terribly much work to lead the snowboarding industry. And I don't mean to be arrogant when I say that. Quite the opposite. We're fortunate enough where, Jake's 40 years of working his ass off to make Burton and snowboarding, the sport of choice for and the brand of choice for the 20-somethings and the 30-somethings of the world. And that is also happening in China. The lifestyle component of snowboarding is, it's one of our main focuses going forward. The opportunity on the business side, which to be honest at Burton, obviously it's a business, but it's not our main focus. Our main focus as a brand is to, first and foremost, have as much fun as possible and share that fun. It's really one of Jake's visions early on. And he tells a story about when he started Burton, the reason he started it because he wanted to make just a bunch of money. And he knew it'd be a sport someday. And honestly, the first year he failed. And after the first year, he switched his mindset to really being focused on the rider, focus on doing the right thing for the brand, for the sport, and then the business would follow. And that's been Burton's direction since the late 70s. And I do believe it's one reason why Burton is Burton, because the business is important, but that's not first and foremost. So as we look at the Chinese market, and we know that we will do well in the snowboard industry. We don't have to do a lot of work to be the industry leader in China. We don't have to do a lot of work to really be successful on the business standpoint. Again, that's not us, though. We will work hard on the snowboarding side. But where we see the opportunity to really share the spirit of Burton and share Jake's spirit in China is with the lifestyle side. One of the big differences between the Chinese market and all the other markets around the world is the Chinese consumer doesn't really know Burton yet. I've been fortunate enough to work all over the world for Burton, and I'll meet people either on a chairlift or a bar or wherever I'll meet them, and just chat up a conversation. I'll say, "Yeah, I work for this company called Burton." "Oh, Burton snowboards. I love Burton, but I'm not a snowboarder, so it's not necessarily a brand for me." But so for the Chinese consumer, we have this ability to position the brand a little different in their mind. So the mind space that we're hoping to own with the Chinese consumer is much more about the lifestyle side, bringing the spirit of snowboarding to the consumer 365 days a year. And how we will do that is through the apparel side of the business. We will, our business format and how we're going to take the brand to the markets will be a little bit different than the other markets. And right now, presently in China, mono-branded stores are extremely important for a brand. There's the shopping malls everywhere in China are destinations. People, it mentioned everything's very digitally focused. However, that retail brick and mortar is still an area of importance for a brand because it really validates a brand. Some of the shopping malls in China are destinations for people to go to really learn about what's new in the industry, or in the retail world. There's some amazing shopping malls. One of the top selling shopping malls in the world is actually in Beijing. It's called SKP. I think they did US dollars 2.6 billion in sales last year. One of the top shopping malls in the world revenue wise. Their biggest day was November 16th last year, and they did 150 million US dollars in sales in one day, which I thought was pretty impressive. So to be in these shopping areas, it validates the brand. And again, if you go to a shopping mall, you're not going to go to a shopping mall to buy a snowboard or boots or bindings, but you're going to go there to, maybe buy a backpack, maybe buy some apparel. And that's a format that we will evolve in China a little bit differently than in the other worlds, the other regions. We're planning to have that 100 to 150 square meter stores that are very much talking about the lifestyle of the brand, the fun, the travel, the art, the music, everything that makes up the lifestyle around snowboarding will be really telling the consumer that story at these smaller mall-based stores. And of course, in the same breath, we will have flagship stores around the major cities in China. And those will be truly the full rollout of the entire product line and the service and the community building that's so important around the sport.
The last episode of the year might just have been our favorite, so we're dropping a snippet here to entice and encourage everyone to go back and give the full episode a listen because it's well worth it. Gordon Holden is Director and Professor of Political Science at the China Institute, as well as an adjunct professor of business at the Alberta School of Business at the University of Alberta. This episode was all about China's maritime positioning and activities, and this excerpt is Gordon talking about the imperatives driving China's focus on the maritime geography surrounding its borders and beyond.
Chinese culture, and I think many of your listeners understand this is a culture where there's built in a very strong emphasis in public pronouncements on the positive. You don't get too much, the mask slips sometimes, but you don't get too much of the sort of realpolitik assessments you get from American think tanks or even American security officials. It tends to hew to a very much their own values, but an internationalist positive spin. Calculating what are their actual maritime intentions, you have to look not just at what they say, at what they do. And of course, as with most countries and particularly most great powers, there's always going to be a gap between the ideology and the actual practice. And that's true of the United States, in my opinion. I'm not saying they aren't about building and supporting democracies, but they also have taken a very realpolitik view of the earth historically. And China is is no different. What's interesting for me in the Chinese case, though, is that China, again, has moved from autarky, from an economically self-reliant phase with basically a closed economy and a closed nation. That ended decisively in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping and reformers opened the door and opened China to global prospects. China is now the leading trading partner of most countries on earth, about 2/3, I believe. And they are the world's largest trading power. And they are, interestingly, the dominant commercial factor in international commerce. Not that these are necessarily goods are always sailing under Chinese flags, but they dominate more than half of the iron age trade that moves by sea that goes to China. Same for most of the base metals. The trade is dominated by China. So they have these two imperatives. One, wanting to protect their coast, to project force out from their coast, to dominate their region strategically, which all great powers tend to want to do in their neighborhood. But they also have this extraordinary trading relationship. It's interesting to me. It's interesting to me that in the case of the Royal Navy in the UK, the British Empire, where commerce led ahead of the political expansion in many cases of the empire, United Kingdom moved from a defense focused on those small islands that comprise the UK to a broader emphasis on freedom of navigation, controlled by the Royal Navy, and support of trade, both their own mercantilist trade, but also more generally free trade. The United States went through the same development. If you look back into the 19th century, you find America building a host of forts, some along the Canadian border, but others on the coastline, defending their coast potentially from a war with a renewed war with the United Kingdom, Britain. Gradually, however, though, deeper into the 19th century, America expanded its capacity, both in trade and naval terms, to the point that the U.S. Navy then began in the 20th century to replace the Royal Navy, or to work alongside them, but then eventually replacing them as the global patrol force in support of international commerce and free trade. I've been watching to see and waiting to see whether we'll see the same evolution of Chinese maritime thinking. Once they feel more comfortable in dominating the South China Sea and their immediate littoral, will they begin to shift to an approach whereby the movement of their own navy abroad, freedom of navigation for naval ships, will begin to overcome that maritime border protection sense, where they'll want to sail their ships freely around the world. It will be, because of their own strength, less concerned about a handful of naval vessels approaching their own shores. We will see. I haven't seen it yet, certainly in their ideology, and you see it only in a very limited practice. It's true that they do exercise with the Russian Navy, even in the Baltic and the Mediterranean and elsewhere. They sail ships, naval ships now, particularly into patrolling the approaches, the Malacca Straits, the Persian Gulf. Sometimes it's anti-piracy. It's very often, I think, eventually a way to protect their own supply lines in case of a conflict. But we may yet see, and this would be projecting deep into the 21st century, a more global approach, whereas it will not just be a coastal protection thing, a immediate zone of influence, but in a global Chinese naval role in the way that you see, supported by bases, in the way you see the U.S. Navy playing that role and the way that Britain did before.
And that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed our 2021 year in review, and we look forward to seeing you all again next year. Again, from all of us here at the Negotiation and WPIC Marketing and Technologies, we wish all of you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands just like yours enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co, and be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. 再见。